They say the wind on Eilean Moor carries voices. I used to think it was nonsense, just the way the gales shriek through the rocks, whistling through cracks in the lighthouse walls. But now, standing on this desolate island with the sea roaring around me, I'm not so sure. I am the last lighthouse keeper of Eilean Moor. In 6 months, this place will be fully automated, its beacon controlled by machines, its rooms left empty. No more keepers, no more watchful eyes, just a light flickering in the dark, and whatever lingers here after I'm gone. The boat that dropped me off has already disappeared beyond the horizon, swallowed by the endless gray sea. There is no turning back, no roads, no bridges, no way off unless the supply crew comes. I am alone. I hoist my duffel bag over my shoulder and make my way up the stone steps toward the lighthouse. The wind howls, pushing against me like invisible hands. The lighthouse stands tall ahead, cold, silent, waiting. It is a massive thing, built over 100 years ago, with thick iron doors and narrow spiral staircases winding up to the lantern room. The walls are streaked with salt, and the windows are dull with age. I unlock the heavy door and step inside. The air is thick with the scent of old wood, oil, and the faintest trace of something damp, like the sea, but deeper, like it has soaked into the very stones of this place. I flick the switch. The overhead bulbs flicker before settling into a dim glow. I drop my bag in the keeper's quarters. The room is small but functional. A bed, a desk, a chair. A single bookshelf leans against the wall, filled with weathered logs and old records from the keepers before me. I run my fingers over the spines, feeling the dust gather under my nails. On the desk, a logbook waits. A fresh one, for me to fill. Beside it, an older, leather-bound journal sits, its pages yellowed with age. I open it. The first page has only 5 lines, written in bold, deliberate handwriting. 1. Never let the light go out. 2. Lock every door behind you. 3. Do not listen to the voices. 4. At night, stay on the top floor. 5. If you hear knocking, never open the door. I stare at the words for a long time. A chill runs through me, though the room is warm. A joke, maybe? Some old superstition passed down from the previous keepers? I shut the book and push it aside. Outside, the sky darkens, and the first stars begin to flicker through the clouds. It's time to check the light. I climb the narrow stairs, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Each step feels heavier, as if something unseen is pressing down on me. When I reach the top, I unlock the lantern room and step inside. The great Fresnel lens stands before me, its glass panels clean, its mechanisms well maintained. I check the controls, making sure everything is in working order. With a turn of a switch, the light hums to life, casting a brilliant white beam out to sea. For a moment, I watch as the beam sweeps across the water. It is the only light for miles, a single glowing eye in the vast, empty dark. Then, something moves on the cliffs below. A shadow. Just for a second. I freeze, my breath caught in my throat. The wind howls, rattling the glass. I press a hand against the window, peering out. But there's nothing there. Just the waves crashing against the rocks. Just the wind. I shake my head, exhaling slowly. It's my first night, and already I'm seeing things. I take one last look at the horizon, then turn off the main lantern room light, leaving only the beacon burning. As I lock the door behind me and descend the stairs, I try not to think about the rules in the logbook. I tell myself they don't mean anything. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the wind whisper through the cracks in the stone, I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, is watching. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the windows of the lighthouse as I sat at the desk, making my first official log entry. The lantern's glow flickered against the damp stone walls, casting shifting shadows that seemed to breathe with the storm outside. February 3rd. Weather rough. Winds at 40 knots. Swells reaching 15 feet. Light operational. No issues to report. I set the pen down and rubbed my temples. The first few days were always the same. Routine, silence, isolation. I had done this job for years, but this time felt different. The emptiness of Eilean Moor weighed on me more than usual. Maybe it was the history of the place, the lingering stories of the keepers who had vanished over a century ago. Or maybe it was just the way the wind seemed to whisper words I couldn't quite make out. I shook off the thought and stood, stretching my stiff limbs. I needed to check the light. Grabbing my oil lantern, I climbed the spiral staircase, my boots echoing against the stone steps. The higher I went, the colder it became. By the time I reached the lamp room, my breath came in faint clouds. The great glass lens stood in the center, a rotating eye that swept its beam across the Black Sea. Everything was in working order. I made a note of it in my log and stood for a moment, watching the ocean. The storm churned the waves, sending them crashing against the rocks far below. The sky was black, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything. Then I saw it, a shape, a lone figure standing on the cliff edge, just beyond the ruined chapel. It was hard to see through the rain, but it was there, motionless, staring toward the lighthouse. A trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe a shadow cast by the beam. I turned to check the controls, adjusting the rotation speed. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I felt a shiver creep down my spine. The island was uninhabited. No boats were due for another week. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew better. I locked the lamp room door behind me as I descended, feeling strangely uneasy. I had been alone for only 2 days, but already something felt off. Back in my quarters, I reached for my logbook to record the sighting. But when I opened it, my hand froze. The pages had been turned. I had left it open to my own fresh entry, but now a different page lay before me. The ink was faded, but the date at the top read December 1900. It was an old entry, written in the careful hand of a keeper long before me. We see him now, watching, waiting. The knocking will start soon. I slammed the book shut. The wind outside screamed against the glass, and for the first time since arriving, I felt truly afraid. The light is not supposed to flicker. Not ever. That's rule number 1. Tonight, it does. I notice it while making my last rounds. The wind howls outside, rattling the glass of the lantern room. The beacon turns, sweeping over the black ocean, its powerful beam cutting through the mist. I watch the steady rhythm. Light, darkness, light, darkness. Then a break. A flicker. A brief hesitation in the beam's rotation. I frown. Could be the wind shaking the mechanism. Maybe a fault in the power. But when I check the control panel, everything reads normal. No warning lights. No loss of power. The light flickers again, just for a second. Then again. I feel in my chest, that slow, creeping unease. I climb the metal steps to the lantern room, the highest point of the lighthouse. The bulb, massive and blinding, hums softly. The gears beneath it turn smoothly, no sign of obstruction. I place a hand on the metal casing, warm, just as it should be. But the flickering doesn't stop. The wind screams around the tower. The storm is getting worse. Rain lashes against the glass in heavy sheets. I check the panes, making sure nothing is loose. I run a hand along the metal framework, searching for damage. Then I see it. A shape, outside beyond the glass, standing on the edge of the cliff. A figure, barely visible in the sweeping light. My breath catches. It's hard to make out, blurred by rain and distance, but it's there, a person. No flashlight, no jacket, just standing against the storm, staring up at me. I grab the binoculars hanging from the railing and raise them to my eyes. The next sweep of the light comes, illuminating the cliffs. The figure is gone. I lower the binoculars, heart pounding. I scan the rocks below, the narrow path leading up from the supply dock. Nothing. Just the crashing waves and the endless, empty darkness beyond. I tell myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the lighthouse beam, shifting with the wind. But something inside me knows better. I turn back to the lantern. The light flickers again, and for the briefest moment, less than a second, I see a reflection in the glass. Not mine. Someone standing behind me. I spin around. The lantern room is empty. Just the hum of the bulb. Just the wind and the rain. I swallow hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. Slowly, I back away, one step at a time, keeping my eyes on the reflection, watching for any movement. But when the light sweeps again, the image is gone. I force a breath and grip the railing, steadying myself. My hands are shaking. I don't go back to my quarters right away. Instead, I sit in the lantern room, watching the light, making sure it doesn't go out. It flickers one more time. Then the knocking starts. The wind has a way of getting into your head out here. It never stops. It howls through the cracks, whistles past the tower, rattles the old wooden beams. On calm nights, it hums like a distant song. On stormy ones, it screams. But tonight it speaks. I was writing in the logbook when I heard it. A voice, just beneath the wail of the wind. It wasn't clear at first, just a murmur, something I could almost explain away. The wind bouncing off the cliffs, the sea pulling at the rocks. My own mind, stretching the silence into something more. But then it came again, closer, more distinct. Callum. I froze, my pen hovering above the page. The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but I knew what I'd heard. My name, not just a sound that resembled it, not a trick of the mind. My name, spoken by something outside. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against a stone floor. The room felt colder than before. I turned toward the narrow window that overlooked the sea, but there was nothing, just the endless black of the waves, the beam of the lighthouse sweeping across the dark. The wind rose again, moaning against the glass. And then, Callum, come outside. I felt my stomach twist. My body wanted to move, to step back from the window, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot. The voice wasn't coming from the radio. It wasn't from a passing ship. It was coming from the wind itself. Slowly, I reached for the radio on the desk, flicking it on. Lighthouse keeper to mainland. Do you read me? Static. Then, after a pause, the usual response from the Coast Guard. Reading you. Eileen Moore. Everything all right? I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? I'm hearing voices in the wind. They'd think I was losing it. Maybe I was. Yeah, I said finally. Just checking in. A brief silence. Then, copy that. Storm's moving in tomorrow. Stay safe. The radio clicked off. I stood there for a long time, gripping the edge of the desk, listening to the wind press against the walls. It didn't speak again that night, but I barely slept. The next morning, I forced myself back into my routine. Made breakfast, checked the light, wrote in the log, but the feeling of unease never left. Every time the wind picked up, I found myself listening too closely, waiting. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, I noticed something odd. There were scratches on the walls. Deep, jagged marks running along the stone of the staircase. They hadn't been there before. I would have seen them. They looked old, but something about them felt fresh, as if the stone had only just been carved. I ran my fingers over the grooves. They were uneven, desperate, like something had been clawing its way up. A gust of wind rushed through the tower, making the beams groan. And then, clear as day, Callum, let me in. I spun around, heart hammering. The voice was inside this time. Not from the wind, not from outside. It was here, within the lighthouse walls. I stumbled back, my breath coming fast. The rules. I had followed the rules. The light was still on. The doors were locked. I hadn't listened to the whispers. Had I? The wind howled through the cracks, pressing against the tower, making the whole place feel like it was breathing. And in that breath, the voice returned. Please. I'm so cold. I turned and ran up the stairs, not stopping until I reached the lantern room, where the light burned steady against the night. My pulse pounded in my ears. I pressed my back to the wall and stared at the single door leading up to the room. Locked. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I wasn't alone here. The wind kept calling my name. The wind had been howling all day. A constant, wailing voice that rattled the glass panes and seeped through the cracks of the lighthouse. By nightfall, the storm had settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below. That was when I heard it. A knock. It was soft at first. A dull tap against the heavy iron door at the base of the lighthouse. I froze, my pen hovering over the logbook. My first thought was that it was the wind shifting something outside, maybe a loose piece of driftwood striking the door. But then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Someone was out there. I stood, my heart pounding in my ears. The lighthouse was miles from the mainland. The supply boat wasn't due for another 2 weeks. No one should have been on the island. I reached for the radio. This is Keeper Callum Fraser, stationed at Eileen Moore. My voice caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? I heard knocking. I needed to be sure. I stepped out of the lantern room, making my way down the spiral staircase. The stone walls were cold, the air thick with the scent of seawater and oil. The metal railing was damp under my fingers. Knock, knock, knock. I stopped. The sound came again, a slow, patient rhythm. My breath hitched. I forced myself forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. The iron door was just ahead, shadowed in the dim glow of my lantern. I hesitated, my fingers twitching at my side. "Who's there?" I called. My voice was steady, but my insides twisted with unease. Silence. Then, scratch. A thin, scraping sound trailed along the outside of the door. Not a hand, not a fist. Something sharper. I took a step back. The wind had started up again, whistling through the cracks of the lighthouse, but it wasn't enough to drown out the sound. Another knock, harder this time. I turned and hurried up the stairs, my pulse hammering in my throat. When I reached the lantern room, I locked the hatch behind me. Rule number 5. If you hear knocking, never open the door. I wrapped my arms around myself, forcing slow, steady breaths. My eyes darted to the window. The light from the beacon pulsed through the thick mist outside. Then I saw it, a shadow at the edge of the cliffs, standing perfectly still, watching. The figure was tall, too tall, its shape stretched unnaturally against the night. My stomach clenched. I stepped back from the window, my breath clouding the glass. Another knock, but this time it wasn't from the door. It came from the window. My blood turned to ice. The lantern room was at the top of the lighthouse. There was no ledge, no way for anyone to reach that high. Yet, the sound was unmistakable. Knock, knock, knock. I did not move. I did not breathe. Slowly, I turned my head. A face was pressed against the glass. But it wasn't a face at all. I never liked the idea of going into the lower levels of the lighthouse. There's something about the damp stone and the air that clings to your skin, thick with salt and mold, that makes you feel like you're trapped in the belly of the thing itself. But on this day, I had no choice. The knocking had gotten worse, and I needed to make sure the doors were sealed tight. I had checked the rooms on the upper floors twice already, but when I passed the iron door leading to the cellar, I noticed something strange. The door wasn't fully closed. I never left it like that. I never let it go unlocked. It wasn't the first time I'd found things out of place, but this one hit me in a way that I couldn't shake. With a slow, hesitant hand, I grabbed the handle and pushed the door open. The smell of mildew hit me like a punch. The room was dark, and I could feel the weight of something pressing in around me. The only light was the faint glow of the storm clouds outside, casting ghostly shadows across the stone walls. But something wasn't right. It felt as if the shadows were moving, waiting for me to blink. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the stone floor, and that's when I saw it. There, half hidden behind a stack of old crates and rusted tools, was a small wooden chest. I hadn't seen it before. My heart skipped a beat. There was no reason for a chest to be in the lighthouse. Nothing had ever been stored down here, just the basics: oil, extra bulbs, and old maintenance tools. But this was different. The chest wasn't like anything else. It was weathered, but meticulously crafted, and locked with an old, brass clasp. Against every instinct in my body, I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the wood, I felt something shift in the air. A chill ran on my spine, but I opened it anyway. Inside, beneath a yellowed cloth, was a journal. It was thick, bound in a deep red leather that had long since begun to crack. My hands were trembling as I flipped through the pages. The ink was faded, but still legible, just. The first entry was dated 1900. Keeper's log, November 7th. We've been hearing it for days now. The knocking. First from the windows, then the door. We were warned, but we didn't listen. I fear we've made a terrible mistake. The light flickered again tonight, and I swear I saw a face in the window. I'm writing this down, so I'll have proof if I disappear. I closed the book for a moment, trying to steady my breath. The words hit me harder than I expected, but I kept reading. November 9th. The knocking hasn't stopped. Now it's at the door, every night. But we can't leave. The light must stay on. The ship's passing tonight will be our last chance to send out a signal, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid it's too late. We've been here too long. And now it's in the walls, and I can hear it breathing. I turned the page quickly, desperate to know more. November 11th. We are lost. The others have gone mad, talking to shadows, hearing voices in the wind. I tried to leave this morning, to walk to the chapel for help, but I couldn't. The door was locked, and it was a cold night, colder than it should have been. I thought I saw one of the men standing at the edge of the cliffs, staring at me, but when I blinked, he was gone. I haven't told them, but I know. I know we are not alone here. I felt a cold, sharp knot tighten in my chest. The last entry was written hastily, the ink smudged. November 12th. It came. It came through the door, and we let it in. God forgive us. I can hear it now behind me. It's waiting for the next one. Do not make the same mistake. Don't open the door. I stared at the page for what felt like hours. The last line burned into my mind. Do not make the same mistake. The knocking came then. It was soft at first, just a faint tap against the iron door, but I knew what it was. I knew exactly what it was. My blood went cold, and I slammed the journal shut. I had made a mistake. I had opened it. The chest. The book. I had already crossed a line I couldn't undo. The knocking was louder now, more insistent, but it wasn't at the door I had just come through. It was on the windows that looked out over the cliff. The knocking didn't stop, and it wasn't just on the glass. It sounded like it was coming from inside, from behind the walls, from everywhere. The storm had passed, but something had stayed. Something was still here, waiting. I dropped the journal back into the chest and slammed it shut, as though closing it would close the door on everything that was crawling in the shadows. But it wasn't that simple. I had opened it, and now there was no going back. The knocking continued. It wouldn't stop. I knew that now. It wouldn't stop until I let it in, and I couldn't let it in. I couldn't. But as I stood in the dark, staring at the iron door, I wondered if the door was ever really closed. The first time I woke up on the lower floor, I thought it was just sleepwalking, half dreaming, half waking. I figured I must have gotten up in the middle of the night to check the light or make a note. It wouldn't be the first time I'd done something without thinking. But then I saw my boots by the bed, the exact place I'd left them before climbing the stairs to bed the night before. I stood there for a moment, staring at the boots. The weight of the air in the room seemed to shift, like the walls were closer, like I'd walked into someone else's space. I shook it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself. I hadn't been sleeping properly. But then I noticed the footprints in the dust on the floor. They were mine, sure enough. Size 10 boots, the same heel marks I'd seen 1,000 times before. But they led right back to the bed. The marks were too fresh to have been from the night before. Too perfect, too deliberate. They weren't the kind of scuff marks you'd make if you'd walked around half asleep. These were purposeful, as though someone, or something, had been carefully retracing my steps. I checked the logbook again. I hadn't written anything yet that day, so I moved to the desk. It was there that I noticed something strange. The pages of the log were still open from the night before, but one of them had been turned. It was a new entry. Not my writing. Someone else's. Callum Fraser is still here, at the Lighthouse. It is only a matter of time before he finds it. He must not break the rule. He must not open the door. They will return if he does. I froze. My pen hovered over the page, though I hadn't written a word. The ink was still wet. The handwriting was the same as mine, but I couldn't remember writing it. And it wasn't in the same style. It was frantic, like the person was racing against something. Racing against time. I snapped the logbook shut and hurried down the stairs, hoping to calm myself. The lighthouse felt colder than usual, even with the wind howling outside. The air seemed thick with something I couldn't place, like there was more in the room than there should be. I stood by the bottom of the staircase, trying to push the unease out of my mind. Then I saw it. The marks on the walls. Not scratches, not damage from the storm, but deep gouges. They weren't there before. They hadn't been when I'd gone to bed. But there they were now, 2 sets of thick lines running from the bottom of the wall to the top, like something had tried to climb up from the depths. Something desperate. Something big. I touched the marks, my fingers trembling. The wall felt too soft, as though it had been torn apart by something sharp, something alive. It wasn't normal. None of this was normal. I heard a creak above me and whipped around, but the house was still. I climbed back up to the main floor, my heart thumping too loudly, my chest tight with fear I couldn't shake. The radio hummed with static when I switched it on, the noise deafening in the silence. For a moment, I thought I could hear my own voice, barely audible under the buzzing. "Callum, wake up," it said, low and distorted, like someone whispering from the other side of the room. I hit the off switch, but the words didn't stop. They continued, faint and broken, until they were swallowed by the static. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get out. I ran to the top of the lighthouse, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. The light flickered as I reached the top. It had never done that before. I grabbed a switch, but it sputtered out again. It wasn't supposed to do that. I had checked it just an hour ago. And then the knock came. It wasn't soft this time. It was sharp, like a fist slamming against the iron door at the base of the lighthouse. I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat. I forced myself to move, to step away from the door, but my feet didn't obey. I stood there, staring at the wall, my breath coming too fast. The knock came again, and this time I heard a voice. It wasn't mine. It was lower, rougher. It was pleading. "Callum, let me in." I stumbled backward, my head spinning. The whisper that followed was softer, but it felt like it was everywhere, surrounding me. "It's time. You have to let me in. You've broken the rule." I tried to shut it out. I wanted to, but the voice kept pushing into my head until it felt like it was inside me. The knocking was louder now, filling the room, the walls, the very air itself. My eyes locked on the iron door at the base of the lighthouse, and I couldn't stop myself. I turned to look at the spiral staircase. The stairs led up, sure, but they also led down, and something in my gut told me I didn't need to go up to the light. I needed to go down. I didn't know why, but I knew the door was waiting. The knocking began again. At first, it was faint, a hollow thud, almost like a distant wave crashing on the rocks below. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, more deliberate. It started from the lower floor, right by the heavy iron door that led to the outside, then shifted to the windows. The glass rattled with every knock, like someone was pressing their palm flat against the glass and pounding with their fist. But I knew there was no one out there. There couldn't be. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, my eyes glued to the door. It had to be the wind. It had to be. There was no other explanation. I gripped the banister, so hard my knuckles turned white. But that voice, the voice in my head, the one that had been growing louder, tugging at the edges of my mind, was telling me something else. "Let it in. Stop it," I whispered to myself, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "You're not losing your mind. It's just the storm. Just the storm." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The storm had stopped hours ago. The wind outside had quieted to a dull hum, yet the knocking continued, relentless, mocking my attempts to ignore it. I couldn't breathe. Every second felt like a lifetime. And then I heard it clearly. Through the pounding, through the wind, a voice. "Callum," it said, soft but unmistakable. "Callum, please. Let me in." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. My name, my full name, spoken with an urgency that I couldn't shake. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I wanted to run. I wanted to lock myself in the top floor and never leave. But my feet wouldn't move. The knocking continued, more frantic now. Knock, knock, knock. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped forward, unable to stop myself. The door. The door. The one rule I had always followed without question. Don't open it. Never open it. But the knocking, the voice. It sounded so real. It sounded familiar. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door. Seconds felt like hours. The weight of the silence pressing down on me was suffocating. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling the very air of the dead. "Please, Callum," the voice begged again. "It's cold out here. I need you." I didn't think. I couldn't think. Without even realizing it, I was moving down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. My hand reached for the heavy brass doorknob, its cold surface sending a jolt through my fingers. The door swung open with an eerie groan, like a long-forgotten secret being revealed. There was nothing but darkness. The kind of darkness that swallows everything. Sound, light, even the air itself. The blackness outside felt wrong, unnatural, like the world beyond the door had ceased to exist. There were no waves crashing against the cliffs, no wind howling through the island. Just emptiness. I blinked, disoriented. I stepped forward, my foot hovering just above the threshold. The air outside was still, too still. There was no movement, no sounds of the island's creatures, no rustling leaves or the whispering wind. Just silence. Absolute silence. "Callum." The voice again, this time closer. So close I could almost feel the words against my skin. I turned quickly, but I didn't see anything. The lighthouse behind me, was as empty as ever, the dim light flickering faintly through the cracked windows. There was no one around, no one but me. I tried to move. I tried to back away from the door, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Every movement was sluggish, as if I were wading through water. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Something in my chest tightened, constricting my lungs. And then it happened. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the entire lighthouse, sending a tremor through the floorboards. I stumbled backward, barely catching myself on the railing. My heart raced, blood rushing in my ears. I spun around, my hands reaching for the handle, but it was locked. The door was locked. I tried again, tugging on the knob, yanking with all my strength. Nothing. The knocking started again, but it wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from inside the lighthouse. Knock, knock, knock. I turned slowly, dread seeping into every part of me. My eyes widened as I saw me. There I was, standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at myself. My own eyes, wide and filled with terror. My mouth moving in silent words. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was me, but not me. I could feel it. Something was wrong. My body felt wrong. And then, with slow, deliberate steps, my other self began to move toward the door. Toward me. My breath caught in my throat. No, this can't be happening. I reached for the radio, but before I could turn the dial, the knocking came again. Louder, closer, and the voice, my voice, called out from the darkness behind me. Callum, it's time. And that was when I knew. I had broken the last rule. I had let it in. I don't know how long I've been here now. Days. Weeks. Time doesn't seem to exist in this place anymore. It bends, stretches, loops around itself like the endless ocean that crashes against the cliffs, taunting me. The knocking hasn't stopped. I've stopped counting how many times it comes. Sometimes it's soft, other times it pounds against the door so violently I think it might break the frame. But I've learned not to open it. That was the first rule I broke. And now, I can't stop hearing it. The whispers, too. They come through the radio, from the walls, from the wind itself. They call me, beckon me. They say things I don't understand, things that twist my insides into knots. My name, my voice, their voices, all of them blending together in a maddening chorus. I've tried to shut them out, but it's impossible. They are inside me now. I've stopped writing in the logbook, because it writes itself now. Every page fills with more madness, more cryptic warnings. And, at the end of every page, I see the same thing. My name, and a date. The date that I know that we will disappear. I went to the window earlier. The wind was still, the sea quiet for a moment, as if holding its breath. And there, in the distance, was the figure, standing on the rocks, staring up at me. But this time it was different. It wasn't just the one figure anymore. There were others. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but no, there were more of them, like the lost keepers from 1900, their faces pale and empty, eyes black as the ocean depths. They moved as one, slow, deliberate, and I knew, without a doubt, that they were coming for me. I should have locked the door. I should have followed the rules, but I didn't. I went down to the base of the lighthouse. The knocking had stopped, and I felt a strange calm wash over me, a peace I hadn't known in weeks. The door was waiting. I could hear it now, feel it vibrating in my bones. A promise. I reached for the handle, and that's when I saw it. The logbook, open to the last page, the one with the cryptic final entry. The one Callum had written, and then the one I had written too. And I understood now. I understood everything. It was a cycle, a curse, a tether between the island and whatever it was that lived here, in the shadows, in the sea, in the walls of this lighthouse. The keepers weren't meant to leave. They were never meant to leave. The knocking came again, this time soft at first, but then it turned into a maddening bang, louder and louder until I could hardly hear my own thoughts. My heart pounded, my hand shaking as it hovered over the door. It had to be done. I had to open it. I turned the handle, and that was when I saw Callum, or at least what was left of him. He stood in the doorway, his eyes hollow, a reflection of everything I had become. He was wearing the same uniform, his face as pale as the dead keepers outside. His voice was a rasp, a whisper on the wind, but I heard it clear as day. You shouldn't have opened the door. You are the last lighthouse keeper now. We all are. And we are never leaving. He stepped forward, and I backed away, stumbling in fear. The air grew thick, suffocating. The lighthouse seemed to pulse with something ancient, something alive. The darkness crept in, filling the room, wrapping around my body like chains. I could hear the knocking again. Only now, it wasn't from the door. It was from inside my head. It's time. You're one of us now. You'll stay here, as we did, as we always will. And as I watched, the lighthouse faded from view, the walls collapsing into shadow. The sea turned black, the sky swallowed by endless night. I was no longer alone. We were all together now. The keepers, the lost, the forgotten. Trapped in the loop, forever bound to the island. The last keeper. The rules are the same, and I have already broken them all. There is no escape. There is only the knocking, the whispers, and the never-ending cycle.